and he's an associate professor of psychiatry and an associate member of the psychology department at McGill. He trained in clinical psychology at McGill and got his PhD in 2001. He then pursued postdoctoral training in longitudinal diagnostic assessment of psychiatric disorders at Yale University from 2001 to 2003. And then he had an Udding postdoctoral fellowship for studies in depression here in the Department of Psychiatry. The primary goal of Dr. Dunkley's research has been to examine the mechanisms through which perfectionism is a personality vulnerability factor for depression. His research examines stress and coping processes that instigate and maintain depressive symptoms in non-clinical community adults and depressed adults. Dr. Dunkley has received FRSQ Chercheur Boursier Junior 1 and 2 salary awards. He's obtained grants from federal and provincial agencies and has published several articles in respected journals using structural equation modeling, path analysis, and multi-level modeling as the primary data analytic techniques. In 2005, he received the Canadian Psychological Association President's New Researcher Award. So without further ado, Dr. Dunkley.
Thank you very much. Okay, so that's the title of my talk. So I'd mentioned, I guess it was 3 research days ago with youth, and before that there was the 9th research day, which was about the conception of mental illness as brain disease and kind of looking at social, political, and economic perspectives on that. And I thought at the time I might have liked to have contributed to that day. We already had 4 speakers, but it's as my research kind of looks at human beings as more complex in terms of having hopes, dreams, aspirations, whereas often research there's been a lot of debate about how, in terms of hiring decisions or grants, how it's kind of a brain on a stick, as this comic portrays. There's this saying or quote from Howie Mandel, who's been promoting the Bell Let's Talk campaign, that I think makes a lot of sense. If we cared about our mental health like we care about our dental health, we would be okay. And he says, this is the solution to making this world better. So I don't know if you agree or disagree, but I certainly agree with that. I've studied depression, and in particular the 2 mood states, high levels of negative affect and low levels of positive affect, that characterize depression and map onto the overarching treatment goals of reducing distress and bolstering resilience in patients. I see a lot of, having turned 40 recently or 5 years ago, I made a lot of a few visits to physiotherapists for various ailments, and I kind of see a parallel between how they approach their problems and how I see approaching psychological problems. So 1 year I had a shoulder problem where I couldn't lift my shoulder above my I couldn't lift my arm above my shoulder. And so I went into the office, and they rotated my arms in all these different positions, and to identify a trigger point where the pain got worse. So when I raised my arm above my shoulder, that's when I got the trigger point. And then also they established what was maintaining the problem. It was actually a knot in the back of my shoulder, and that's why the pain wasn't going away. And then they gave a bunch of strengthening exercises to bolster resilience and preventing the injury from coming back. And this is very similar to how we'd approach with a daily diary methodology. What increases negative mood? What increases positive mood? Why doesn't negative mood go away? What can I do to improve my mood? So I started out, my first daily diary study was in 1999 as part of my doctoral thesis, and back then we would use paper and pencil questionnaires, and where participants would fill them out every night and then mail them back in the next morning, and then the research assistant would have to enter thousands of records. So that would take months till you have your data, and it also fills up a lot of filing cabinets. So for my initial studies here, we're also paper and pen. I'd fill up about 1.5 big filing cabinets. So eventually I wouldn't have any space, and so it's simply not practical, wasn't practical, to use these paper and pencils in the hospital, because literally the whole hospital would just be filing cabinets and there wouldn't be room for patients and doctors. So, but there's advantages of these approaches in general. In particular, in contrast to a physiotherapy office, where they can do all the movements of your arm in the office, in psychology, the person has to go out into their daily lives and experience the situations that trigger their distress. So that's one advantage. Another is coming into the office once a week. If you're depressed, you tend to see things in black-colored glasses, kind of thing, and so you won't remember those moments where things are better or worse. So reducing recall bias, and then we get to look at changes from day to day. So that's one of the big additions of digital technology. I should add, I personally don't have a smartphone or an iPhone. I do research, but I'm not a techie in this way. And so for me, it's really practical. There's an emphasis on, what can it give us in terms of practicality. Coinciding with this electronic methodologies has been advances in statistics and mathematics, because this is a lot of information that's coming at us. And so for several years, I've analyzed these kinds of data, and I've shown demonstrated, there's a few things like that you have to look out, like in day-to-day changes, you have to be able to assess them reliably. And change in itself, it's unstable, unpredictable, so you need measures that can detect those changes. And but to get back to complexity, it's often things work in systems. So I look at symptoms of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. In going back to physiotherapy example, my wife had shoulder and neck problems a couple years back, and she went to several physiotherapists. She had massage therapists treating the symptom, which was a sore neck and shoulder, and it wasn't working. And eventually she went to a naturopath, and he said, no, the problem, it's in your foot. You have high arches, and as a result, you're overcompensating, and that's what's causing your problem. So that ability to see things more holistically, as opposed to just treating the symptoms. And that's kind of what looking at complex patterns can buy us in psychology. Now, so after years and years of doing these studies, it hasn't had an intervention component, but now we're looking at developing feedback. As Mark was saying, I would pay participants to be in these studies, but I wasn't giving anything back to them. Whereas now, I want to give back to them and use it. They would find the self-monitoring useful, but we can do a lot more with that now that we can have these advantages. And we can do an instant analysis of the patient's daily diary data, and because we have those previously validated models that have been shown to be relevant to hundreds of students, community adults, depressed patients, relevant across thousands of situations in their lives. Because we've shown that, we can take each person's data, compare it to those models, and make sense of it. And this will promote a shared understanding between therapists and patients of both negative and positive aspects of mental health, guide multiple choice points of intervention, and inform tailored treatments. So right now we're kind of at the pilot stage where we're consulting with clinicians, and this was an example from the depression study. And so what we're doing is we developed these algorithms in just Excel, and we're plugging in data, previous data. But this is a patient who moderate to severely depressed, had borderline traits, so Dr. Biskin might be interested, and was taking a medication. And she did the diaries at time 1, but then she only completed 5 therapy sessions, and which isn't therapy, isn't psychotherapy. She only did a self-report measure of depression at 6 months and didn't come back for the 1-year follow-up. So now the question is kind of brainstorming with these clinicians in the CBT service, and to, what could we have done differently? Could this have added something? So we took this person's data, plugged it into our algorithm program, and saw that the day when she had higher negative mood was this event. The boy I thought I was dating apparently wants nothing to do with me. So there we see her sadness on that day increased to a 65 out of 100, versus like a 30, I think was her average. Her stress level was 85 out of 100, perceived him as being inconsiderate. And self-blame a lot. So here we have items that assess criticizing the self, becoming focused on your deficiencies as a person. So that was 100 out of 100. She perceived less control. It was out of her hands, this situation. And she gave up on what she wanted, which is avoidance, behavioral disengagement. She gave up on her goals, her values. And because we've done these previous studies that have linked these things, we can give the person a narrative. So on this day, they blame themselves and perceive less control, and that was connected to them giving up on their values, and that was linked to feeling more stressed and more sad. And within that, there's multiple places you could go as a therapist. But it's not enough just show one event. I mean, that's helpful, but it's good that we could draw on other events, not just in the interpersonal sphere, but also in terms of paying rent, not having any money. And so we see this is a general pattern that when you have these increases in perceived criticism, self-blame, and less perceived control, she avoids more and feels more sad. So then another question is what increases positive mood? And this is it's a different question entirely. So it's not just about, patients don't want to just know about reducing their distress. They want to know about positive mental health functioning, and which is a separate thing. So here the event is, my best friend's boyfriend is in town for a few days. Apparently he finds me very attractive, and since we were drunk at some point, he tried to come on to me. I was so uncomfortable that I left. So there, on the surface, doesn't seem like a very positive event, and but for this person, it was her best day, apparently, and which was a 23 out of 100 positive. So that's still very low, but 4 of our other days were zero positive mood. So that's what she's giving us, and that's what we will work with. There, she perceived more control over the situation, so went from a 17 from the other situation to an 83. So perceiving like she can do this, she can handle this. She was 0 behavioral disengagement, so 0 giving up on on what she wants, 0 giving up on what she values. Her problem-focused coping was 83 out of 100 as opposed to 0 in other situations. So, coming up with a plan on what to do, which was to leave the situation, and she acted on it. She had more positive reinterpretation. So again, this is 25, other days is 0, but feeling like this is a challenge, an opportunity to grow as a person, and also feeling that there's some support, that she has other people to turn to for emotional security. And because we have previously established these connections, we can have a little narrative that ties all these elements together. So, for example, she perceived more emotional support, and that was connected to her positive thinking and perceptions of control, and as a result, she didn't give up on her goals and came up with a plan to deal with it, and this was connected to her increase in positive mood. Okay. So, and then we see that as a general pattern for another day. When friends came over, apartment was a mess, neighbors complained about noise levels, and that was another. So these kinds of patterns are linked to improvements. So now the third nice thing about this whole digital age is Steve Jobs himself realized this isn't just about technology and numbers and that. It'll really realize its potential when you can marry them with the liberal arts, with the humanities, and that's the result that will make our hearts sing. So there's lots of movies out there that make millions and hundreds and millions of dollars, and that kind of tap into these themes. And so here we have a line from Bruce Banner, with this movie, that's a man-sized if, and our job is if, and is what Tony Stark replies. And so there's all these contingencies in daily life, and as researchers or professionals, we want to give our patients, it's our job to show them the ifs, and then they can make changes. And another quote from Tony Stark about how are we planning to beat them together. And that's, again, we have all these different elements, people with different strengths, variables, and that can help overcome difficulties. Why isn't negative mood going away? So here, I've studied self-critical perfectionism for a while, and for my career, and yeah, for 20 years, boy oh boy. So yeah, and this is there's individual differences in feeling I am bad, and this was from Michael Moore's documentary on the American culture in the early 2016, even before Trump was elected, and just that the core ideology of the U.S. isn't about capitalism, it's that people are bad. People are so bad that they have to be constantly controlled and threatened with punishment, and if they get a moment of freedom, they'll go crazy and ruin everything. So in that movie, he tells stories about people having to beep in every break and that they take from work, and so. But a lot of people internalize this this harsh negative self-view and contingencies of self-worth. And this patient was similar, so we can average across all 7 days and show that this person has more negative mood and sadness than the average person, and even depressed patient is more self-critical and perfectionistic than others, and it also has more negative social interactions, and also tends to give up from across many stresses, and we show that in days 1, 6, 7. And so because we have all these elevated levels of these 4 things, we can get an idea of what's maintaining her negative mood, comparing to our previous research. And essentially, her self-critical perfectionism kind of drives the maintenance of behavioral disengagement and negative social interaction, and that explains why her negative mood is maintained. As well, there's less positive mood relative to other people on average. And there she has less perceptions of social support, so perceiving she can't count on others, less positive thinking on average, and less problem-focused coping. And there, so then we can come up with a conceptualization of what's maintaining her low positive mood, and it's essentially she feels very alone and that other people aren't supportive, and that's kind of connected to her less positive thinking and problem-focused coping. Now, another thing of having these, so as I said, that research was on hundreds of students, patients, and so forth. So there's a normalizing function. But then you have other things from multimedia or music, the music industry, and albums that have really resonated with people, such as this album from Pink Floyd, The Wall. That's one of the top-selling albums of all time. The Concert's is the largest selling concert of all time by a solo artist, and now the far one, Another Brick in the Wall, starts at Place des Arts. They're doing an opera for it, which my wife and I are going to in 2 weeks. So I'm dragging her with me. But essentially, it's a way of connecting with people these themes of isolation and giving up and so forth. So then this all leads, having identified a number of mechanisms and processes that are triggering and maintaining the moods, we can then move on to interventions. And again, real change is hard work. So let's make it fun. And that's what I realized with these complex models in terms of you have to have illustrations and because it's hard work to digest that stuff. And so if you can have connections. So here we have the largest, probably the biggest grossing movie franchise of all time, which kind of links onto these themes about overcoming fear within the self and not letting your inner demons take over and let your fear and worry rule you, versus the good side, which is sharing your hope with others, staying optimistic, putting your feelings into action. So a lot of these can kind of support those themes, which I think there's a thirst for psychology out there, and that's demonstrated by just the droves and droves of people that attend these movies, that then we can connect with empirical data to make it all the more meaningful. Yeah, so I mentioned I went to Jamaica, and a lot of things, the phrase of the week was respect, man, respect. Like if you tip a person, it's respect, because a lot of these people, they're exploited by government or agencies, and so whenever you do something nice, there's a respect mal. So how could we, in terms of this person, that would be reducing negative social interactions. This is how are we going to reduce this person's negative mood? And there's multiple choices here, and we know from the previous work that if you can change one of these, it has an impact on the other. So reducing negative social interactions, reducing self-blame, reducing avoidance, increasing perceived support, or perceived control. And then on how to increase positive mood, it's increase perceived social support, perceived control, positive reinterpretation, and problem-focused coping. So that's what we would have done with that patient. That's where we could have gone. Maybe hopefully to engage them quicker in therapy and guide therapy more quickly, and we may not have lost them. So we've started to pilot this with treatment-resistant patients who won't do their written thought records, but they did online reports. And they said they had an emphatic preference for that self-monitoring online. They're very interested in their personalized findings, and the feedback was instrumental in the patients and therapists agreeing on what needs to be changed, because here the information is coming from the patient. It's not the therapist directing and giving them their interpretations. The patients collaborated, and this has also helped instill hope in the therapist struggling to work with patients. It gives them more focus with patients who aren't really giving them anything from their daily lives. We're doing a pilot work at McGill Mental Health. So we're now progressing. So we want to recruit 12 McGill University students, 12 patients at the JGH CBT service, and we're actually giving our first set of feedback this week to 2 pilot participants at McGill Mental Health. And very important, I was talking with Anita at the break, and how to disseminate this. And I don't see this at first. I'm training students and graduate level research assistants to deliver this feedback, because there aren't enough mental health professionals. And it's kind of a step towards an app. But for now, we're doing demos to get feedback from clinicians, interns, and researchers to assess the usability and acceptability, and then we'll obtain preliminary data on its impact on psychotherapy processes, things like the Therapeutic Alliance, patient empowerment, as well as outcomes like depression, anxiety. And then of that once we've developed that further, we'll investigate whether the feedback intervention can enhance evidence-based interventions. And this is a quote from a research participant, and I've been hearing this for many years, but she said, this should be transformed into an app for smartphones or online platform for the mass public, not as a study, but as a self-coping mechanism. So it's it's been a long journey, but I really feel you need that foundation, and then we're at a stage now with the feedback intervention. So this is just to give acknowledgement of various mentors, collaborators over the years, students, RAs, and postdocs, as well as funding agency, SHRC and FRSQ. Thank you very much.